My husband demanded a divorce and took everything we had built together, the house, the cars, every bank account we owned. Then he looked at our son and coldly said, "I don't want the child." My lawyer pulled me aside outside the courtroom and whispered, "If you sign these papers, you'll lose everything." But I only smiled, picked up the pen, and said, "Give him all of it." Everyone thought I had lost my mind. At the final hearing, he watched me transfer every asset into his name with a victorious smile, until his own attorney suddenly leaned down and whispered 5 words that made the color drain from his face instantly. "I am so glad you stayed." Before this story begins, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Your country, your city. Let me see how far this has traveled. This story contains fictional elements for entertainment and educational purposes. Names and settings are coincidental. The message, however, is one I hope you keep. The ballroom of the Vance Grand Hotel smelled of gardenias and old money. They always ordered gardenias for black tie events. I had written that specification into the original design brief 31 years ago, when this building was still a gutted shell on King Street, and Robert and I were eating sandwiches on the subfloor because we could not afford a lunch break. I chose gardenias because their sweetness carries a faint edge of warning underneath it. I thought that was the right scent for a room designed to make people feel like they had arrived somewhere important. I had forgotten that I was the only one who still knew that story. I sat at table 14 near the back of the room beside a floral arrangement that partially blocked my view of the stage. This was not an accident. Seating charts for events like this are engineered as carefully as the buildings that host them. I had designed enough of these rooms to understand that where they put you tells you everything about where they think you belong. Table 14, behind the flowers, near the exit. On the stage at the front of the room, my husband stood at a podium beneath a chandelier I had personally selected from an artisan glassmaker in Savannah. The light caught the crystal drops and scattered small rainbows across the ceiling. I remember driving 4 hours each way to inspect that chandelier before approving it. Robert had been at a golf tournament that weekend. He was speaking now holding a crystal award that read, 35 Years of Excellence. The room was full. 400 people in formal wear, the finest hospitality professionals, in the Southeast Investors City officials, the mayor of Charleston, sitting 3 tables from the front. They were all watching Robert Vance describe the vision and determination it had taken to build something lasting. I picked up my water glass and took a small sip. On the large screens flanking the stage, images rotated slowly. The flagship lobby with its white marble floors and the curved staircase I had sketched on a napkin at 2 a.m. because the original architect's design felt cold. The courtyard garden of the Savannah property, which I had redesigned entirely after the first contractor got the proportions wrong. The rooftop terrace in Asheville, which had taken me 11 months to get approved by the Historic Preservation Board. Image after image of rooms I had walked through 1,000 times. Rooms that existed in a particular way because of particular decisions I had made alone on nights when Robert was traveling or entertaining or simply elsewhere. Robert thanked his financial partners. He thanked the management team. He thanked the city of Charleston. He thanked a golf buddy named Chuck for believing in him in the early days. He did not say my name. Not once. Not even in passing. Not even as an afterthought at the end, the way people sometimes add a spouse's name to a speech, the way they add parsley to a plate. A garnish. An acknowledgement that cost nothing. Nothing. I set my water glass down carefully. The table linen was a shade of ivory I had approved for all Vance properties 7 years ago after spending 3 weeks reviewing fabric samples. I pressed my fingertips against it for a moment, feeling the weight of the weave. Then I applauded with everyone else when the speech ended. The drive home to Sullivan's Island took 22 minutes. Robert drove. I watched the lights of the Arthur Ravenel Bridge pass overhead, those long white cables lit against the dark sky. I had always thought that bridge was one of the most beautiful things in South Carolina. Robert had always said it created traffic problems. We did not speak during the drive. He pulled into the driveway and went inside ahead of me. By the time I came through the front door, he was already in his study with the door half closed. I stood in the entry hall for a moment. The house was quiet. Toby was staying at a friend's place that night. On the kitchen counter sat a manila envelope. It was thick cream-colored with the name of a law firm printed in the upper left corner. Nolan Pierce and Associates. I did not know that name. I stood in my kitchen in my evening dress and looked at it for a long moment before I picked it up. Inside was a document 41 pages long. Attached to the front page was a yellow sticky note in Robert's handwriting that said only, "Read when you are ready." I read it standing at the counter. I did not sit down. I did not pour myself a drink. I simply turned the pages in the order they were numbered and read every word. It was a prenuptial agreement, dated 3 months before our wedding. It outlined in careful legal language that in the event of a divorce, I would receive a lump sum payment of $180,000 and waive all claims to any business assets, properties, or holdings accumulated during the marriage. I turned to the last page. At the bottom on the signature line designated for the party of the second part was a signature. The ink was slightly faded with age, the way signatures on old documents tend to look. The handwriting had the shape and slope of my own. I stared at it for a very long time. I had never signed this document. I had no memory of any prenuptial agreement. We had never discussed one. In the weeks before our wedding, I had been finishing a commission project and planning a ceremony for 60 people and learning that I was 3 weeks pregnant with Toby. But the signature looked like mine. I set the document down on the counter. I pressed both palms flat against the cool marble, the same marble I had chosen for this kitchen 11 years ago from a supplier in Vermont. Robert's light was still on in the study. I did not knock on his door that night. I simply picked up the document, walked to the bedroom, and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. I looked at that signature for a long time, turning the page slowly in the low light. Somewhere between the gardenias and the crystal chandelier and the applause of 400 people, I had become invisible. The question was what I was going to do about it. Robert came downstairs at 7 the next morning wearing a gray suit and a tie I did not recognize. He went to the coffee maker, filled a mug, and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the water. He did not ask whether I had slept. I had not slept. I was sitting at the kitchen table with the 41-page document in front of me and both hands wrapped around a cup that had gone cold 2 hours earlier. I had read it 4 times. I understood every line of it. I understood it the way you understand a thing that has been designed to be final. He turned around when he heard me set the cup down. "I thought we should talk about the timeline," he said. That was how he began. Not with an apology, not with an explanation of what had changed or when he had decided or how long the decision had been forming behind the face I had looked at across a dinner table for 33 years. He began with logistics. He began with the timeline. "The prenuptial agreement is registered with the county clerk's office," he said, sitting down across from me. "Victor Hollings notarized it 3 months before the wedding. Everything is in order." Victor Hollings. I did not know that name. I wrote it in the margin of the first page, small and precise, while Robert watched. "You'll receive the settlement within 30 days of the filing. $180,000 as specified." He said the number the way he said hotel occupancy rates. Flat. Informational. "The properties and business assets remain with the company, which means they remain with me. The legal team has already prepared the transfer documentation." I looked at him across the table. I thought about the lobby of the first hotel, the way the morning light fell through the east-facing windows I had specifically positioned for that effect. I thought about the 11 months I had spent getting the Asheville rooftop approved by the Historic Preservation Board driving up on weekends while Robert played golf. I thought about the gardenia specification I had written into the design brief 31 years ago. I did not say any of this. "There is also the matter of Bella Sinclair," he said. He said the name without hesitation, the way people say the name of someone they have already decided everyone will simply have to accept. Bella Sinclair was 25 years old. She had been working as a marketing consultant for one of the hotel's regional accounts for 14 months. She would be moving into the Sullivan's Island house within the week. He did not say he was in love with her. He did not say much about her at all, which told me everything I needed to know about what she represented to him. She was not a confession. She was a transition. I looked down at the document, at the signature line. The prenuptial was signed by both parties, I said. It was the first thing I had said since he sat down. It was, he said. I don't remember signing it. He held my gaze. People forget things from 30 years ago, Eleanor. This was technically true. People do forget things from 30 years ago. What they do not forget is signing a legal document that would determine the rest of their financial life in the event of a marriage ending. That is not the kind of thing that slips from memory the way a phone number does, or the name of a restaurant you visited once. But I did not say this either. What I understood sitting at that table on a Tuesday morning while the coffee went cold and the October light came through the kitchen windows was that Robert believed the document was untouchable. He had walked downstairs with the easy confidence of a man who had already accounted for every possible response. He was not nervous. He was not braced. He was simply delivering information the way you deliver a weather report to someone who is about to go outside. That told me more than the document itself. I turned to the last page and looked at the name printed below the signature line. The attorney who had prepared the agreement. Nolan Pierce. The same name on the divorce filing he had given me the night before. I had seen that name before. Not recently. Years ago in the vendor records for one of the early hotel renovations. A billing account that had never quite made sense to me when I reviewed the quarterly reports. I had flagged it once and forgotten about it when Robert said it was a compliance matter that had been resolved. I wrote Nolan Pierce below Victor Hollings in the margin. Then I closed the document and folded my hands on top of it. I'll need a few days to review everything with my own attorney, I said. Robert nodded as if this was expected and entirely manageable. Of course. Take the time you need. He finished his coffee, rinsed the mug in the sink, and picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. He was at the kitchen doorway when I heard the sound of a footstep on the stairs. One careful step, and then stillness. Toby. Robert glanced toward the hallway. The footstep did not come again. He adjusted his jacket, said he would be home late, and left through the front door without looking back. I did not move for a moment. Then I looked toward the staircase. The landing was empty. But the silence that came from the direction of Toby's room was a different kind of silence than the silence of someone sleeping. It was the silence of someone who had been very still for a long time and was trying to decide what to do next. The movers were not coming. That was the first thing I decided. Robert had offered to arrange them the way he arranged everything related to the logistics of my departure, efficiently, impersonally, as if coordinating a hotel checkout rather than the end of a marriage. I told him I would handle it myself. He did not object. A woman packing her own boxes was easier to manage than a woman with an attorney. I started on the 24th of October, 1 week before the date he had specified. I worked in the mornings before Toby left for school, and again in the evenings after he came home. We did not talk much while I packed. Toby would sit on the floor of whatever room I was working in and hand me things when I reached for them, the way he used to sit beside me when he was small and I was working at the drafting table. Robert had walked through the house 3 days earlier with a roll of blue painter's tape and marked everything that was to remain. The art on the walls, the furniture, the kitchen appliances, including the espresso machine I had bought with money from my first freelance commission in 1989, 2 years before I met Robert. He had taped that too. I did not argue with the tape. I understood what he was doing, and I understood why it would not matter. What I was allowed to take filled 4 medium boxes and 2 garment bags. Clothing, books, a small framed photograph of Toby at 8 years old standing on the beach at Isle of Palms with his shoes off and his face turned toward the sun. My reading glasses. A lamp from the bedroom that Robert had never liked. On the morning of the 28th, I was working through the storage room at the back of the house when I found it. It was in a large plastic bin marked for disposal. Robert's handwriting, black marker. The word donate printed in the flat capitals he used for everything. Inside the bin were old files, outdated instruction manuals, a broken clock radio, and at the very bottom, beneath a folded window, shade a brown leather notebook, 9 inches by 12, its cover worn thin at the corners from years of handling. I had not seen it in a long time. I had not looked for it because I had not allowed myself to think about it. The notebook was from 1991. I had bought it from an art supply store on King Street the week after Robert showed me the building he wanted to turn into a hotel, a 3-story structure from the 1880s that had been empty for 6 years and smelled of damp plaster and old wood. He had the idea and the bank connection. I had the eye. I had the ability to look at a gutted commercial space and understand what it could become if the proportions were respected and the light was handled correctly. I spent 4 months filling that notebook. Every measurement, every material specification, the curve of the main staircase, the placement of the windows in the east-facing rooms to catch the morning light. The lobby floor plan I redrew 11 times before the proportions felt right. The gardenia specification for event nights noted in the margin in pencil because I thought it was a small detail, and small details are the ones that last. On the first page in the upper right corner, I had written my name and the date, Eleanor M. Vance, March 1991. Beneath it, in smaller letters, Vance Grand Concept and Design. I held the notebook for a moment in the storage room with the overhead light humming above me. Then I set it on top of the box I was filling. Robert appeared in the doorway. He looked at the notebook on top of the box. He looked at me. "That is just old junk," he said. "Leave it." "No," I said. It was a small word, 1 syllable. I had not raised my voice. I had not explained myself or offered a reason. I simply said no and placed both hands on top of the notebook, and Robert looked at me for a moment with an expression I had not seen on him before. Not anger, something closer to recalibration, as if I had said something that required him to adjust a figure in a calculation he had believed was already final. He left without saying anything more. I put the notebook in the second box beneath my winter coat and continued packing. That evening, Toby helped me carry the boxes to the front hallway. We made 4 trips. Neither of us mentioned that the entryway of the house, the entryway I had tiled in a chevron pattern using stone from a quarry outside Columbia, looked smaller with my boxes stacked against the wall. After dinner, I was sitting in the bedroom reading when I heard a quiet knock at the door. Toby opened it without waiting for an answer, which was something he had done since he was small. He stood in the doorway in his school sweatshirt, one hand on the frame, and looked at me with an expression that I recognized immediately. It was the expression of someone who has been holding something for a long time and has finally decided the weight of holding it is greater than the weight of putting it down. "Mom," he said, "I need to tell you something about Bella Sinclair." He came in and closed the door behind him. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the knock, which had been quiet enough to be uncertain, but the way he pulled the door shut afterward with both hands, making sure the latch caught. Toby had been closing doors behind himself since he was 4 years old. It was a habit I had never had to teach him. But that night, it meant something different. It meant he did not want what was about to be said to leave the room. He sat down on the edge of the bed a few feet from where I was sitting. He did not look at me right away. He looked at the floor between us at the worn edge of the area rug that had been in this bedroom since before he was born. His hands were in his lap, loose and open. "I saw them," he said, 2 years ago. Dad and Bella Sinclair. I waited. "It was at that restaurant on Meeting Street, the one you and Dad used to go to for anniversaries." He paused. "Fig. I was walking home from Marcus's house and I passed the window and I saw them at a table in the back. They were close together. It was not the way you sit with someone from work." Fig Restaurant was 4 blocks from our house. Toby had walked past it hundreds of times. 2 years ago, he was 13 years old. "I stopped on the sidewalk," he continued. "I thought maybe I was wrong. I stood there for a while trying to think of a reason it was something else. Then Dad turned and I saw his face and I knew I was not wrong." He stopped again. Outside the window, the harbor was dark and still. "Why didn't you tell me?" I said. It was not quite a question. He lifted his head. Because I thought if I said something, it would become real. And if it became real, everything would break. And I thought I kept thinking that maybe it would just stop on its own. That if I didn't say anything, maybe it would just end and no one would ever have to know and we would all just continue. He pressed his lips together. But it didn't stop, he said. And now everything broke anyway. And the only difference is that I knew for 2 years and didn't say anything, and you didn't know. And that is not right. That is not how it should have been. I understood exactly what he was describing. The specific arithmetic of a child trying to hold a family together by staying very still and very quiet, as if the family were a sleeping animal that might be disturbed by sudden movement. Children do this more often than parents know. They absorb information that is too large for them, and they carry it alone, because the alternative saying it out loud and watching it land seems worse than the weight of silence. The weight of silence is never lighter than it feels at the beginning. It only grows. Toby, I said, look at me. He did. You were 13 years old. You saw something you did not fully understand, and you made the decision that most 13-year-olds would make, which was to protect the people you loved by not saying a word. That is not a failure. That is not something you need to apologize for. He shook his head slightly as if he were not entirely convinced. But you didn't know, he said. You went to his dinners and his events and you sat there and you didn't know and I did. That is not I should have told you. You deserved to know. Yes, I said. I did. And I also know that you are 15 years old and that the thing you were being asked to carry was not yours to carry. It belonged to him. It was his weight. He put it on you without asking. That is what I am angry about. Not you. Never you. The room was very quiet for a moment. Then Toby put his face in his hands and his shoulders dropped, and he cried in the concentrated, effortful way that boys cry when they have been holding something for a very long time and have finally let themselves stop. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was simply the sound of 2 years of silence finally moving through him and out. I put my hand on his back and I did not say anything else. There was nothing else that needed saying. Some things do not need to be resolved. They only need to be witnessed. After a while, he straightened up. He wiped his face with the back of his hand and looked at the floor again, and then at the window. What are you going to do? He asked. I am going to think, I said, carefully, for as long as it takes. He nodded as if this was the answer he had expected, which perhaps it was. He had lived with me for 15 years. He knew how I worked. He stood up, said goodnight, and went back to his room. I sat in the dark for a long time after he left thinking about a 13-year-old boy standing on a sidewalk on Meeting Street at dusk, looking through a restaurant window, trying to find a reason that what he was seeing was not what it was. I turned off the lamp and lay down without changing out of my clothes. I did not sleep for a long time, but when I did, I slept without dreaming, which was the first time in several nights that had happened. I was still in the same position when I woke to daylight and the sound of music rising from the floor below. It was not music I recognized. It was not music that had ever been played in this house before. It was loud and bright, and it moved through the ceiling above the kitchen the way something moves when it is not trying to be considerate of the people around it. Bella Sinclair had arrived. The lease office on Ashley Phosphate Road was a narrow room with drop ceilings and a wall calendar still showing September. The property manager, a heavy-set man in his 50s named Dale, slid the rental agreement across the desk without making eye contact. $980 per month. First and last month required upfront. Available November 1st. I signed where he indicated and wrote a check from the account Robert did not know about, a small personal account I had maintained since the late 90s for freelance design work that came to me occasionally, people who found my name through old professional contacts. It had never held more than a few $1,000s at any one time. It held enough now. Dale handed me 2 sets of keys on a plastic ring and said to call the number on the refrigerator if anything stopped working. I thanked him and walked back to the car. The boxes were already there, loaded the night before with Toby's help. 4 medium boxes and 2 garment bags, which was the same number I had packed and which was all I had taken. I drove north on Interstate 26 with the windows down because the afternoon was warm for November, and I wanted the air moving through the car. I did not cry. I want to be clear about that because it would be easy to assume otherwise. The drive from Sullivan's Island to North Charleston is less than 20 minutes, and for most of those minutes, I was simply watching the road and thinking about the order in which I would unpack. What happened that same evening at the house I had just left, I did not witness. What I know about it, I know because Toby told me several days later in pieces, the way he told me most things that were difficult to say. This is what he described. By 6 o'clock that evening, there were 4 people in the Sullivan's Island house who had never been inside it before. Friends of Bella Sinclair, 2 women, and a man. People Toby did not know, and whose names he never learned. There was music. There was a bottle of something opened in the kitchen. Toby stayed in his room with his headphones on and his door closed, but the music moved through the walls the way music does in a house you know well enough to understand its acoustics. At some point during the evening, one of the women said something that made the others laugh, and the laughter carried up the stairs and under Toby's door and into the room where he was sitting on the edge of his bed, staring at a spot on the floor. What he told me he kept thinking about was the dining room table. It was a table I had found at an estate sale in Beaufort 11 years ago, a long oval of pale oak with a surface worn smooth by other families before us. I had refinished it myself over a weekend when Toby was 3 years old and had spent most of that weekend sitting beside me on a folded towel on the garage floor, handing me sandpaper when I reached for it. He told me he could hear them at that table. He could hear the chairs moving and the glasses being set down. He could hear Bella Sinclair's voice, which he described as carrying the kind of voice that expects to be heard. He put his headphones back on. He turned the volume up. In the morning, he packed a bag. He did not tell anyone he was leaving. He did not leave a note. He simply put what he needed into a backpack and a duffel bag and walked out of the house at 7:45 in the morning while Robert was in the shower and Bella was still asleep. He took the bus to North Charleston for the first time in his life, transferred once on Rivers Avenue, and knocked on the door of apartment 214 on the 3rd floor of a building he had never seen before. I had been awake since 5. I was sitting at the small table by the window with a cup of coffee when I heard the knock. I opened the door, and Toby was standing in the hallway with a backpack on one shoulder and a duffel bag on the other, and his school jacket zipped to the chin. He looked at the apartment behind me, at the water-stained ceiling and the narrow kitchen and the window that looked out onto the parking lot. He looked at it the way you look at something you have already decided about. "It is not so bad," he said. We both knew that was not entirely true, but it was what we needed it to be, so that is what it was. I stepped back and he came inside. He set his bags down by the smaller bedroom and stood in the center of the main room looking at the 4 boxes I had not yet finished unpacking. "Do you want help with those?" he asked. "Yes," I said, "I do." We spent the rest of the morning unpacking. We did not talk much. There was not much that needed saying. By noon, the boxes were broken down and flattened in the hallway, and Toby had arranged his books on the shelf above the smaller bed in a particular order that I did not ask about, and we ate sandwiches at the small table by the window and watched the parking lot, and did not mention the house on Sullivan's Island at all. That evening, after Toby had gone to sleep, I heard it for the first time. A sound from the apartment next to ours, something shifting, a drawer opening and closing, then the particular sound of a chair being pulled across a floor by someone who was alone and not concerned with being quiet about it. Someone was living in apartment 216. They had been there before I arrived, and they had not yet seen any reason to introduce themselves. The faucet in the kitchen dripped at a rate of approximately once every 4 seconds. I know this because I counted on the first morning, standing in the narrow kitchen in the gray light, before Toby woke up trying to determine whether it was something I could fix myself or something I would need to report to Dale. I fixed it myself. The washer inside the tap was worn flat and needed replacing. I found a hardware store 2 blocks east on Rivers Avenue. bought a pack of washers for less than $2, and had the faucet working properly by 8:15. I had spent 11 months navigating the Charleston Historic Preservation Board to approve a rooftop installation. A faucet washer was not going to defeat me. The carpet in the main room was thin and had a faint burn mark near the window, roughly the size and shape of a paperback book. Someone before us had set something hot on the floor there. I moved the small table from beside the door to cover it, which made the room look more deliberate, as if the arrangement had always been that way. These are the adjustments you make. You look at what is in front of you and you decide what can be changed and what can simply be reframed, and then you do the work. Toby left for school at 7:40. He was enrolled at the school nearest the new address transferred on short notice, which meant he had to explain himself to new teachers and find new routes through new hallways. He did not complain about this. He simply put his jacket on and went. I spent the morning on the telephone. I had a list of 11 names. People I had worked with or alongside over the years, contractors, designers, project managers, suppliers I had used during the years when my involvement in the Vance properties was at its most intensive. People who had seen my work firsthand and knew exactly whose decisions had produced it. I called all 11. 3 of the numbers were no longer in service. 4 went to voicemail and were not returned, not that day, not the days following. 2 were picked up by assistants who took messages that led nowhere. One man I had worked closely with on the Savannah renovation spoke with me for 4 minutes in a tone that was kind but careful, and said he was sorry, but he was in the middle of a project and could not take on additional conversations at the moment. He wished me well. He hung up. The 11th number belonged to a woman named Patricia Elms, who had supplied the stone for the Sullivan's Island kitchen 11 years ago. She picked up on the second ring and said without much preamble that she had heard about the divorce, that she was sorry, and that she could not afford to be involved with anything related to Robert Vance's situation right now because her company had 3 active contracts with his properties. Then she said she hoped things would work out and ended the call. I set the phone on the table and looked at it for a moment. Then I picked up my pen and crossed all 11 names off the list. This is how influence works when it belongs to one person in a partnership and not to the other. The reputation, the relationships, the phone calls that get returned, all of it had traveled under his name for 33 years. When the name was removed from my side of the equation, I did not have a network. I had a list of people who remembered me fondly and could not afford to say so. That was the afternoon I understood the full dimensions of what I was facing. Toby came home at 3:40. He dropped his bag by the door and stood in the kitchen looking at the now silent faucet with mild approval. I made dinner from what we had, which was not much but was enough, and we ate at the small table and talked about his new school in the clipped factual way of people who are both doing their best not to make a situation feel harder than it already is. After he went to bed, I sat at the table alone and opened the 1991 notebook. I did not look at the sketches this time. I had looked at the sketches enough in the days since I'd found the notebook in the disposal bin. Instead, I turned to the inside front cover where I had written my name and the contact information that was current at the time. A telephone number with an area code that no longer existed. An address on Rutledge Avenue where I had rented a studio apartment during my first 2 years in Charleston. And below that 2 lines I had written in pencil, so lightly they were barely legible. A note to myself about the intended scope of the project, design and architectural concept, interior specification, material selection, phased construction oversight. Sole author, E.M. Aldrich. Aldrich had been my name before the marriage, Eleanor Margaret Aldrich, a name that appeared on exactly one professional record of the Vance Grand Hotel project, in pencil on the inside cover of a notebook that Robert had put in a bin, marked for disposal. I sat with that for a long time. Then I closed the notebook, put it under the table where I could feel it against my ankle, and turned off the lamp. In the hallway outside our apartment, the overhead light ran all night, which I had not expected. It came under the door in a thin yellow line. Across the hall, the same line showed under the door of apartment 216. Someone in there kept their lights on late. I had noticed it the first night and every night since. In the morning before Toby woke, I made 2 cups of coffee. I drank one standing at the kitchen window, watching the parking lot come awake below. Then I carried the second cup to the door, opened it quietly, and set it on the floor in front of apartment 216. I did not knock. I did not wait to see if it was taken. I went back inside and closed my own door and began another day. 22 mornings. 44 cups of coffee, counting the ones I drank myself. The cups left outside apartment 216 always disappeared by noon, which meant someone was taking them, which meant they were being consumed or discarded. I did not allow myself to speculate which. The act of leaving them was the point. The response was not mine to control. On the 22nd morning, the door opened before I could set the cup down. The man who opened it was in his early 70s with white hair that needed cutting and a gray beard that suggested he had stopped attending to it several weeks ago. He was wearing a flannel shirt and old corduroy trousers and no shoes. He was also, I noticed already, holding a cup of coffee of his own, which meant he had been awake for some time and had simply chosen not to open the door on the previous 21 occasions. He looked at me. He looked at the cup in my hand. "You've been leaving those," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," I said. "Why?" I considered the honest answer, which was that I was not entirely sure, and decided that the honest answer was probably the right one. "Because you were here, and I had an extra cup. And because someone who keeps their lights on until 2 in the morning is either working or can't sleep. And either way, they probably want coffee." He looked at me for a long moment. His eyes were sharp in the way that certain people's eyes remain sharp long after the rest of them has softened the specific alertness of someone who spent decades in rooms where missing a detail had consequences. "You're Eleanor Vance," he said, Robert Vance's wife. I had not told anyone in this building my name. I thought about that for a moment. "Ex-wife," I said, "as of approximately 3 weeks ago." Something shifted in his expression. Not softening, more like a recalibration of some kind, the way a calculation changes when one of the variables turns out to be different than assumed. "Come in," he said. He stepped back from the door. His apartment was the same layout as ours, 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, but it was unrecognizable in its current state. Filing boxes were stacked along every wall from floor to ceiling, labeled in a precise hand with dates and category codes I did not immediately understand. The furniture was minimal, a small table, 2 chairs, a desk, with an old laptop on it. A gray cat of considerable age and apparent indifference was asleep on top of one of the filing boxes nearest the window, its tail hanging over the edge. The man sat down at the table. He did not offer me the other chair, but he also did not ask me to leave, so I sat down. "Warren Pruitt," he said, "in case you were going to ask." I was. "What did you do?" I said. "Before. I was the chief financial officer of Vance Hospitality Group for 11 years. He said it the way people state the name of a country they used to live in, a fact about the past that is still true, but no longer current. Until 8 years ago when your husband decided I had become a liability. He told me the rest without much elaboration in the flat, condensed tone of someone who has told a story so many times internally that the telling of it aloud has become almost mechanical. Robert Vance had been running a tax evasion structure for years. Revenue shifted through a series of vendor accounts expenses, inflated certain transactions recorded in ways that reduced the company's taxable income significantly. Warren had not designed the structure, but as CFO, his name appeared as the authorized signatory on many of the documents that made it work. When the arrangement began to attract attention from the IRS, Robert needed the exposure to land somewhere other than on himself. It landed on Warren Pruitt. The evidence presented at trial included documents that Warren maintained he had never seen, transactions he said he had never authorized, and a paper trail that had been constructed with enough technical precision to withstand the scrutiny of the investigators assigned to the case. Warren had no resources left for an adequate legal defense by the time the case came to trial. He served 3 years in a federal facility in Estill, South Carolina, 2 hours from Charleston. By the time he came out, his wife had filed for divorce. His daughter had changed her phone number, and the only asset he had managed to retain was this apartment which he had purchased outright in his own name before the legal proceedings began. And the files. I kept copies of everything before they came for the originals, he said. Stored off-site. I had them transferred here when I got out. He looked at me steadily. Now, why should I trust you? You lived in that house for 30 years. You attended his dinners. You sat at his tables. Whatever he built, you benefited from. It was a fair question. It deserved a fair answer. I reached into the bag I had brought and placed the 1991 notebook on the table between us. I opened it to the inside front cover and turned it so he could read the handwriting at the bottom. Design and architectural concept interior specification. Material selection phased construction oversight. Sole author E.M. Aldrich. Warren read what was written there. He did not speak for a long time. Aldrich, he said. That was your name before the marriage. It was. He put his name on your work. He put his name on everything, I said, including yours. Warren sat back in his chair. The gray cat opened one eye from its position on the filing box and then closed it again, apparently satisfied that nothing in the room required its involvement. After a long moment, Warren stood up. He walked to the far end of the apartment to the last row of filing boxes against the wall. He put his hand on the handle of the bottom drawer of the unit at the end of the row, and then he stopped. He stood there with his hand on the handle and did not move. If I open this, he said without turning around, we are both committed to whatever comes next. I want to be clear about that before I do. I looked at the back of his flannel shirt, at the filing boxes stacked to the ceiling around him, at the years of careful documentation stored in that room waiting for exactly this conversation. Open it, I said. The drawer did not stick. It opened smoothly the way something opens when it has been opened many times before by someone who knew exactly what was inside it and had decided each previous time to close it again. Inside were 4 accordion folders, each labeled with a year and a category in Warren's precise handwriting. He carried them to the table one at a time and set them down without comment. Then he sat across from me and watched me open the first one. The documents inside were copies. Photocopies, printouts, scanned pages, but they had the quality of things that had been produced carefully and preserved deliberately. Each page was dated. Each set of documents was paper clipped together with a handwritten index card describing the contents. The index cards were written in the present tense as if Warren had composed them, expecting that someone would eventually read them under circumstances exactly like these. What the files contained was a structure, not a simple crime, but an architecture of concealment built over years and involving multiple moving parts. The core of it was this. Vance Hospitality maintained active accounts with a group of vendors, supply companies, maintenance contractors, consulting firms that existed on paper, were properly registered with the state, paid their incorporation fees, and issued invoices that the company's accounting department processed and paid without question. The invoices were inflated. In some cases, the vendors performed minimal work. In others, the work billed for had never been performed at all. The excess payments flowed back through a series of transfers into accounts that were not connected on the surface to Robert Vance or to Vance Hospitality. The effect over 11 years was a reduction in the company's reported taxable income of approximately $18 million. I read through the first folder carefully. I read through the second. By the time I opened the third, I was no longer reading for comprehension. I was reading for confirmation because I had already understood the structure, and I was now looking for something specific. You flagged this, I said, stopping at a page midway through the third folder. In 2014, you sent a memo. To the board's audit committee, Warren said. Yes, and the memo was buried. The committee was chaired by a man Robert had appointed personally. Yes. I turned another page. Near the back of the folder, behind a divider marked Correspondence, was a copy of an internal accounting summary. At the bottom, under the signature block, was a name I recognized immediately. Cynthia Kerr, Senior Accounts Manager, Vance Hospitality Group. I had hired Cynthia Kerr 18 years ago. She had come to me through a referral from a contractor I trusted, a quiet and precise woman in her mid-20s at the time, who understood accounting systems the way I understood architectural plans structurally from the foundation up. I had interviewed her myself, introduced her to the finance team, and checked in with her during her first year to make sure the transition had gone smoothly. Robert had met her twice at company events and had not remembered her name on either occasion. She had worked at Vance Hospitality for 18 years. She was still there. "Is her number still current?" I asked Warren. He looked at me steadily. "I wouldn't know. I haven't spoken to anyone inside that company since the trial." I called the number I had for her from a contact list I had not updated in 3 years. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. 20 minutes later, my phone lit up with a message from an application I had not used before. The sender's name read CK_internal. The message said, "Not this number. Download Signal. Same username." Signal is an encrypted messaging application. Messages sent through it cannot be intercepted by the carrier network and leave no readable record on external servers. The people who use it routinely are those who have good reason to ensure that what they say cannot be retrieved later by someone with access to phone records. I downloaded the application, created an account, and sent a message to the username she had given me. The response came in less than a minute. What followed was a conversation that lasted 40 minutes, conducted entirely in text, because Cynthia said she could not risk a voice call from inside the building. She was at her desk. She said she had been at her desk when she saw the transfer of the divorce settlement processed in the company's accounts. She had been at her desk when she watched the vendor account structures continue operating after Warren's conviction unchanged, which told her everything she needed to know about who had actually designed them. She had been keeping records for 14 months, detailed records, she said, time-stamped, saved to an encrypted external drive that she kept in a safety deposit box at a bank branch that was not associated with any Vance property. "I have been waiting," she wrote, "for someone to call." I sat at Warren's table with the phone in my hands and looked across at him. He was watching me read his expression unchanged. "She's been documenting for over a year," I said. "Everything." Warren nodded once, slowly. The way a man nods when something he calculated would happen eventually has finally happened. I typed a message back to Cynthia asking her to send what she had compiled as soon as it was safe to do so. She confirmed she would. She said she would need a few days to prepare the files securely. Before the conversation ended, she added one more message. "There is also something in the company records that you should know about. A life insurance policy. It was taken out 8 months ago. It is attached to your son's name. The listed beneficiary is not you." I need to pause here for a moment because what I am about to tell you is the detail that changed everything for me. If you are still with me, drop the number 9 in the comments right now. Just that. No explanation needed. I will know what it means. A small note: parts of this story have been shaped for clarity and reflection. If you prefer to step away here, that is completely understood. This is your choice to make. Cynthia sent the document through Signal at 11:47 that night. I was sitting at the kitchen table with the 1991 notebook closed in front of me and a cup of tea I had not touched. Warren had gone back to his own apartment 2 hours earlier, and Toby had been asleep since 9. The building was quiet in the particular way that apartment buildings go quiet late at night. Not silent, but settled, full of the small sounds of people existing separately behind their walls. The document was 4 pages. It took me less than 3 minutes to read it. A life insurance policy issued 8 months ago through a private carrier. The insured Toby Robert Vance, minor, child, date of birth, listed policy value $12 million. The policyholder, Robert Alderton Vance. The listed beneficiary in the event of the insured's death, Bella Sinclair. I read that line twice. Then I set the phone face down on the table. I want to be precise about what I understood in that moment because it is important to understand it correctly. In the United States, a parent may legally take out a life insurance policy on a minor child. The beneficiary of such a policy can be any named individual. There is no legal requirement that it be the other parent, a family member, or a trust established for the child's benefit. What Robert had done was not illegal. What it was intentional. He had stood in a courtroom and declared in front of a judge that he was relinquishing all custody rights to his 15-year-old son. He had framed this as practicality. He had framed it as generosity. Even Eleanor had the time he had the company to run. But he had walked out of that courtroom and gone directly home to a house where Bella Sinclair was making herself comfortable in the kitchen. And at some point in the 8 months before the divorce, he had arranged for her to receive $12 million in the event that Toby died. He had given up the child as a responsibility. He had kept the child as an asset. I sat at the table for a long time without moving. Then I got up, walked to the smaller bedroom, and opened the door slowly so the hinge would not make noise. Toby was asleep on his side, one arm tucked under the pillow the way he had slept since he was small. His school jacket was hung on the back of the chair with more care than 15-year-old boys typically take with their jackets, which told me he was already adapting to the fact that replacing things here required a different kind of calculation than it had on Sullivan's Island. I stood in the doorway for a long time. I did not turn on the light. I did not go in. I simply stood at the threshold of his room and looked at my son sleeping and said nothing, because there was no one to say anything to. What I was feeling was not grief exactly. It was something closer to clarity. The kind of clarity that arrives when you have been trying to understand the shape of something in dim light, and then someone turns a lamp on, and the shape is both worse than you feared and simpler than you expected. Robert had not simply decided he wanted a different life. He had been constructing the terms of that life carefully over time with the same methodical attention to structure that he had always applied to the company. The prenuptial agreement, the asset transfers, the custody arrangement, the insurance policy. Each piece had been placed deliberately, and they fit together into a design as intentional as any I had ever drawn. The difference was that I understood design. I understood it at a level he had never bothered to comprehend because he had always had someone else to do that part of the work. I went back to the kitchen and sat down again. I opened the notebook to a blank page near the back. There were several. I had only ever used the first 60 or so, and I began to write. Not a plan. Not yet. A list of what I knew, what I had. What was connected to what? Warren had mentioned in passing during our conversation that afternoon that he had maintained a trust account in his own name before the legal proceedings began. He had said the amount was modest. He had said it in the way people mention something they consider irrelevant, which usually means it is the opposite. I wrote the word trust on the blank page and drew a line from it. I wrote the words distressed debt and drew another line. I wrote debt purchase and drew a line from that to the word control. I did not know yet if the architecture was sound. I did not know if the numbers would work, or if the timing was possible, or if the people I would need to make it function would be willing. What I knew was that the structure was there in outline, the way a building is there before the walls go up present, in the logic of the space, waiting for someone to understand it well enough to build it properly. I closed the notebook. I washed the cold cup of tea, set it on the drying rack, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed. I did not sleep well, but at 5 a.m. I was awake and certain which is a better condition than rested and uncertain. At 7:15, after Toby had left for school and the apartment was quiet again, I went to the contact list in my phone and looked for a number I had saved years ago and never used. A name I had heard mentioned at a legal conference Robert had brought me to in 2018. A woman someone had pointed out across the room as the most effective family and asset attorney in the state of South Carolina, Margaret Steele. I had saved the number at the time because I thought it was useful information. I had not imagined standing in that conference room with a glass of water in my hand and Robert talking to someone 6 feet away that I would ever actually need it. I dialed. It rang twice. A woman's voice answered, precise, unhurried. Margaret Steele. "My name is Eleanor Vance," I said. "I need 45 minutes of your time." A brief pause. "I have a hearing at 9. Come at 7:30. I arrived at 7:22. Margaret Steele's office was on the 14th floor of a building on Broad Street 2 blocks east of the Charleston County Courthouse. The building itself was unremarkable from the outside, one of those structures that signals professional seriousness through restraint rather than architecture. The elevator was fast and quiet. The receptionist, a young man named George, who wore the efficiency of his employer in the way he moved, and the brevity of his speech told me Ms. Steele was expecting me and gestured toward the hall. The office at the end of it was ordered in a way that told you immediately that the person who worked there had made deliberate decisions about every object in the room. Bookshelves with case files and matching folders organized by year and color-coded in a system I did not attempt to decode. A desk clear, except for a legal pad, a pen, and a single folder. 2 chairs across from the desk positioned at an angle that suggested the person sitting in them would be expected to talk, not to perform. A window with a view of the steeple of St. Michael's Church, and beyond it, the low skyline of a city that had been processing human decisions, legal, financial, personal, since before the country existed. Margaret Steele was 54 years old. She had dark hair cut short and reading glasses she wore on a chain rather than on her face, which she put on and took off throughout our conversation with deliberate economy, as if the act of changing focus required a physical analog. She stood when I came in, shook my hand with a grip that was firm without being aggressive, and sat. 45 minutes, she said. Go! I went. I had practiced the order of what I needed to say. In the North Charleston apartment at the small table by the window during the hour before Toby woke, I had written a sequence on the blank page of the 1991 notebook and read it through twice. Not because I was uncertain about the facts, but because the manner in which you present information to someone whose judgment you need shapes what they do with it as much as the information itself does. I told her about the prenuptial agreement first, the 41 pages, the signature that looked like mine but was not, the notary named Victor Hollings, whose name I had written in the margin of the document the morning Robert brought it downstairs, the name Nolan Pierce, which appeared on both the prenuptial agreement and the divorce filing. I told her about Warren Pruitt, his 11 years as chief financial officer, the tax evasion structure, the shell companies, the inflated vendor accounts, the $18 million in reduced taxable income over more than a decade, the memo Warren had sent to the audit committee in 2014, which had been buried, the 3 years Warren spent in a federal facility while the structure he had flagged continued operating without him. I told her about Cynthia Kerr, the 18 years of service, the 14 months of documentation, the safety deposit box, the signal messages, the life insurance policy on Toby with Bella Sinclair as beneficiary. Margaret wrote on her legal pad throughout. She did not look up often. When she did, it was to ask a specific question, a date, a name, a dollar amount, and then she returned to writing before I had fully finished answering. She was not building an impression. She was building a record. When I had finished speaking, I opened the bag I had brought and placed the 1991 notebook on the desk. I opened it to the inside front cover and turned it to face her. She put on her glasses and read what was written there. She did not look up while she read it, and she did not touch the notebook. Aldrich, she said quietly, your name before the marriage. Yes. She looked at the handwriting for another moment. Then she took her glasses off and set them against the chain. How long has this notebook been in your possession? Continuously since March of 1991, except for a period when it was stored in a house that Robert Vance owned. He put it in a bin marked for disposal. I retrieved it before the bin was emptied. And the notation was written at the time of the project's inception in your own hand. In pencil. I wrote it the first week I began drafting the concept. She nodded once. Then she sat back, put the pen down on the legal pad, and looked at me with the expression of someone who's been presented with a large amount of information and has organized it into a single clear structure. Most people who come to this office, she said, want help with their divorce. They want a number, a custody arrangement, and a clean exit. They want to be done. She paused. You are not here for any of that. No, Anne, I said, I am not. You want to recover what you built. You want the company. She said it the way you state a fact that you find interesting rather than surprising, which means the divorce case is already behind us. You accepted the terms. Strategically, I said. If I had contested the settlement, Robert would have moved assets, restructured accounts, hidden whatever he could. He needed to believe he had already won before I could show him what he had actually done. She was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up the pen again. The hotels are carrying significant debt against the properties, she said. I know this because I have handled 2 matters involving Vance Hospitality suppliers in the last 3 years, and the financial picture that emerged from both suggested a company running on a margin that left very little room for disruption. If the operating reserve is depleted, I said, then the bank moves to protect its position. And in a situation like this, a portfolio of 7 properties with a senior lender holding security interests across all of them, the bank does not want to manage hotels. They want to reduce their exposure. The instrument they use is a distressed debt sale. She explained it clearly in the way that people explain things they have done many times and have learned to describe without condescension. When a company cannot service its debt and the lender calculates that management is more costly than exit, the lender places the debt on the market. Buyers acquire it at a fraction of the face value in distressed hospitality cases. She said typically between 8 and 15 cents for every dollar owed. The buyer steps into the lender's position and becomes the senior secured creditor. In certain circumstances, with the right documentation and leverage, the debt can be converted into an ownership position in the underlying business. Which means, I said, that the person who buys the debt becomes the person who controls the company. Under the right conditions, yes. I looked at the window. The light on the steeple of St. Michael's was pale and flat in the January morning. I had driven past that steeple 1,000 times. It had always been background. Today it felt like a marker of something. How much would that require? I said. That depends on the state of the portfolio when it becomes available. Based on what you've told me about the company's current leverage, if the operating reserve were to fall below a critical threshold, which could be engineered without illegality, if the conditions were right, the bank would likely move within 60 to 90 days. A portfolio of 7 properties in the current market, offered at distressed rates, would likely clear somewhere between $30 and $45 million. I told her about Warren's trust, the approximate $8 million held independently that had survived the legal proceedings against him because it had been established and registered before any asset freeze was applied. She wrote a figure on the legal pad. That is not enough alone. But I work with a private equity group that has moved on distressed hospitality portfolios before. They require a controlling interest position and a compelling reason to act at pace. She glanced at the notebook. The intellectual property argument is compelling. If the foundational design language of a hotel brand, the concept that generates its identity, its market, positioning its architectural character, can be traced to documented original work by a specific author, that author holds a claim that changes the valuation of what any investor is acquiring. The notation establishes me as the sole author, I said, before the marriage, before the company existed under its current name. It does. She looked at her legal pad. I would need the original document examined by a forensic specialist to authenticate the ink and paper dating. I would need Warren Pruitt's files reviewed by my own financial analyst to establish their evidentiary weight. I would need Cynthia Kerr's documentation secured through a proper chain of evidence. And I would need you to do nothing visible in the meantime. Nothing that would suggest to Robert Vance that anything is being built. Understood, I said. She looked at her watch. Our 45 minutes had elapsed by 3 minutes. She was not the kind of person who noted that. She stood, which was my signal, and walked me to the door of the office. As I stepped into the corridor, I heard her pick up her phone. Warren, she said, not a greeting, a beginning. My name is Margaret Steele. Eleanor Vance gave me your contact. I need every document you have authenticated, indexed, and cross-referenced. Every receipt, every shell company registration, every transfer record, every date. I was nearly at the elevator. When do you need it by... I heard him ask faint through the half-open door. Yesterday, she said. The elevator arrived. I stepped in. The doors closed. I stood alone in the small mirrored space as it descended and thought about a 13-year-old notebook sitting on a desk on the 14th floor of a building on Broad Street, open to a page where someone had once written their name in pencil and believed at the time that the name was enough. It had always been enough. It had simply needed the right room. Warren had a contact in Miami. Not a private investigator, not a lawyer, but an accountant he had worked with during the years when Vance Hospitality maintained a regional office in Miami Beach. A man named Ruben Castillo, who had retired 3 years ago and now did occasional consulting work and apparently occasional favors for people who had once done favors for him. Warren called in one such favor. He did not tell me the details of what he asked or how the request was framed. What he told me was that a file arrived by courier on a Wednesday morning in February, and that after he read it, he came across the hall and knocked on our door at 8 in the morning, which was something he had not done before. I made coffee. We sat at my kitchen table. He put the file between us. Gerald Hatch was 61 years old and lived in Coral Gables. He had built a regional logistics company over 30 years that he sold in 2016 for what the trade press had described as a significant sum. In 2019, Gerald Hatch met a 22-year-old woman at a charity event in Brickell. Her name at the time was Bella Crane. She had recently changed it, the records showed, from an earlier version that did not appear in Ruben Castillo's file. The relationship lasted 14 months. At the end of it, Hatch filed for divorce from his wife of 26 years. The divorce settlement left Hatch's wife with the family home in Coral Gables and a cash settlement. It left Bella Crane with an investment account, a condominium on Brickell Avenue, and a claim against a business partnership that took 2 additional years of litigation to resolve in her favor. She had left Miami in 2022. Different name, I said. Sinclair was her mother's maiden name, Warren said. Legal name change filed in Miami-Dade County March of that year, all above board. I looked at the file. The name of Gerald Hatch's attorney during the divorce proceedings was listed in the public record. I turned the page to find it and read it twice before I said anything. Grant Dell, I said. Warren nodded. Grant Dell had maintained a practice in Miami until 2021 when he relocated to Charleston, South Carolina, where he joined a firm as a junior partner. The firm he joined was Nolan Pierce and Associates. I set the page down. Bella Sinclair had not simply arrived in Robert Vance's life through chance or circumstance. She had arrived through a network that included an attorney who had helped her navigate a previous situation and who was now in a position to help her navigate another one. Nolan Pierce had not only drafted Robert's divorce documents, he had a direct professional connection to the woman who stood to benefit most from what those documents contained. She is not an opportunist, I said. No. Warren agreed. She is a professional. He turned to the back section of the file. Ruben Castillo had included, along with the public court documents, a note of his own handwritten 2 pages, describing what he had been able to determine through sources he did not identify regarding the methods used during the period between the relationship beginning and the divorce filing. One method had appeared in both the Miami situation, and Ruben suggested appeared to be present in the current situation as well. It was a simple technique. 2 people who do not wish their communications to be traceable create a single shared email account. Instead of sending messages to each other, which creates a retrievable electronic record, they compose messages, save them as drafts, and delete them after the other person has read them. No email is ever transmitted. No traffic passes between servers. The draft simply exists briefly in a folder and then disappears. During the Miami proceedings, Grant Dell's devices had been subpoenaed as part of an unrelated bar complaint. Investigators had found evidence of the shared draft account at that time, though the information had not been used in the Hatch case itself. The account Ruben's note indicated had been registered using an address format he had seen Bella use before. A variation of the same format had been identified through a contact whose methods Ruben did not specify in an account currently active and registered to a similar address. Warren and Bella were communicating through a shared draft account, Bella and Nolan Pierce. I sat back from the table. Robert believed he was managing a divorce, a property transfer, and a new relationship. He had the lawyers, the documents, the properties, and the confidence of a man who had never lost at anything he had constructed carefully. What he did not know was that the woman he had moved into his house was not a variable in his plan. She was running her own plan parallel to his using his attorney as her instrument. He was not the architect of this situation. He was the site. "He thinks he is the one doing the hunting," I said. "He always has," Warren said, and there was nothing in his voice except the flat finality of a man who had spent 8 years reaching the same conclusion. I had a grocery run to make that afternoon. The routine of it was deliberate, ordinary, visible life, nothing that would draw attention. The Publix on Rivers Avenue was 12 minutes from the apartment. I was walking back to the car with 2 bags when my phone rang from an unknown number. A woman's voice said that a vehicle matching my car's description had been struck in the parking lot, a hit and run, and that I should come to the south end of the lot to assess the damage. I stopped walking. I looked toward the south end of the lot. My car was there, visible from where I stood approximately 50 feet away. It appeared undamaged. Standing beside it were 2 men I had never seen before. I went back into the store. That was the whole of my response. In that moment, I turned, walked back through the sliding doors of the Publix, went to the customer service desk near the front, and told the woman behind the counter that there were 2 men behaving in a threatening manner beside my vehicle in the south lot and that I needed someone to call the police. She did. I waited inside near the windows where I could see the parking lot. The 2 men were gone before the police unit arrived. The officer who took my statement was thorough and professional. He noted that no crime had technically been committed in his presence, that the men had not approached or touched me, and that the phone call directing me to the lot could not be traced to a registered number. He gave me a case number and told me to report any further incidents. I thanked him and drove to the hospital. The bruise on my shoulder came from catching myself against the door frame when I had stepped back inside quickly. 4 stitches above my right eyebrow came from a display rack I had not seen until it was too late. Neither was serious. What was serious was what the afternoon meant, which was that Bella Sinclair had decided that Eleanor Vance needed to be removed from the situation more efficiently than a divorce settlement had managed. Toby was in the waiting area when I came out. He was sitting in a plastic chair with his school bag between his feet and his jacket zipped to the chin, and he stood up the moment he saw me. He looked at the stitches. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said he had taken the bus. We drove home without talking much. I told him what had happened in the parking lot in the plain, factual version, the version without the parts that would frighten him beyond what was necessary. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he looked straight ahead at the road and said only, "Okay." That single word in that tone told me that Toby understood the situation more completely than I had given him credit for, and that he had decided to respond to it the same way I had, with stillness, with forward motion. We got home at 11:30 at night. In the hallway outside our door on the hook where I usually hung my keys, there was a jacket. It was not mine. I had never seen it before. It was a dark navy wool coat, women's cut the kind with a wide collar that folds down and deep pockets that are actually useful. A small paper tag was still on the inside seam, which told me it had been purchased recently and hung there before Toby came to meet me at the hospital. He had known he was going to the hospital before I called him. He had already been planning to go out. Tucked into the right pocket was a piece of paper folded in thirds, small, unlined, torn from the back of a school notebook. Handwriting I had known since Toby was 7 years old and learning to form his letters at the kitchen table. "You built everything once. You can do it again. T." I stood in the hallway for a moment. I did not move. I read the note twice, and then I folded it once more along its existing creases and put it back in the pocket. Toby was behind me. I did not turn around right away. I kept my hand in the pocket around the folded paper and looked at the door of our apartment. "I've been working at the bakery on Montague Street," he said. 3 weeks. They pay cash on Fridays. I didn't say anything because I wanted it to be enough first. Montague Street was 8 blocks from our building. There was a small bakery on the corner that had been there for 30 years, the kind of place that still kept its hours handwritten on a card in the window. I had walked past it a dozen times. I had not known Toby had walked into it and asked for work. I turned around. He was standing in the hallway with his hands in his pockets, watching me with the steady, careful expression he had been wearing a lot lately. He looked older than 15. He had been looking older than 15 for several months. "Thank you," I said, "for the jacket and for coming tonight." He nodded. "Are you all right?" "Yes," I said, "I am." He went inside. I stayed in the hallway another moment, then lifted the jacket from the hook and put it on. The wool was heavy and warm in the way that good material is warm, not immediately, but steadily, as if it were committed to the work. I went inside. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table. I opened the 1991 notebook to the set of notes I had started in December on the blank pages near the back. I read through what was written. I added 3 lines. Then I closed the notebook, finished the coffee, and sat in the quiet of the apartment with my hands flat on the table. Whatever Bella Sinclair had intended to accomplish that afternoon in the parking lot on Rivers Avenue, she had accomplished the opposite of it. She had clarified something that I had been approaching gradually, carefully, from multiple directions. She had made it simple. It was time to set the trap. Warren had spent 8 years thinking about Robert Vance in the particular way that people think about the thing that destroyed them. Not with sentiment and not with the distraction of anger, but with the specific detailed attention of someone who had decided that understanding the mechanism of what happened to them was the only productive use of that knowledge. He had made a list once in the federal facility at Estill of the things that reliably motivated Robert Vance. Not the obvious things, not money or status, though those were present. The more precise drivers, the ones that bypassed judgment. First among them was this: Robert could not stand to be outbid on something he had decided he wanted. It was not simply competitiveness. It was something closer to a refusal to accept that another person might be positioned to take what he had identified as his. Warren had watched it operate dozens of times over 11 years. It had produced some of the company's best acquisitions. It had also produced 3 decisions that Warren had at the time flagged as financially unsound, which Robert had proceeded with anyway because someone else had expressed interest. The Kiowa parcel played to this exactly. Kiowa Island sits off the coast of Charleston County, accessible by a single road across a causeway. Parts of it are a developed private community luxury homes, a resort, maintained roads, and amenities. Other parts are coastal conservation land, protected under the Coastal Zone Management Act and corresponding EPA regulations, which means they cannot be developed commercially, regardless of who owns them or what they intend to do with the property. The distinction between the developed sections and the protected sections is not obvious to someone who is not a specialist in coastal land law. Warren identified a specific parcel in the conservation area, publicly recorded, visible on any county land map, that sat within sight of the ocean and had no structures on it. It was the kind of land that looked from a distance like an opportunity. We incorporated a limited liability company in South Carolina under a name that was generic enough to be unremarkable: Coastal Venture Properties, LLC, registered to a mail forwarding address in Mount Pleasant. The process took 48 hours and cost $110 in state filing fees. Warren prepared a project prospectus using the vocabulary and formatting conventions of legitimate real estate development documents. It described the parcel in terms of its coastal position, its proximity to the existing Kiowa resort community, and the projected development value of a luxury hospitality property on the site. The critical phrase placed in the environmental compliance section read as follows: subject to pending coastal rezoning review, EPA case number designated anticipated completion within 18 months. The case number was fabricated. The rezoning process it described does not exist in current EPA proceedings. But neither of those facts is immediately verifiable by someone reading the document without cross-referencing the EPA's public case registry, which Robert would not think to do because Nolan Pierce was supposed to do it for him. The prospectus also contained a brief note in the competitive landscape section indicating that a Miami-based investment group had submitted a preliminary letter of interest for the same parcel. The note included the name of an entity that was not traceable because it did not exist. Getting the information to Robert required a channel that could not be connected to either of us. Cynthia Kerr managed the accounts for all of Vance Hospitality's third-party contractors. One of those contractors was a facilities management company whose regional representative, a man named Dennis Farwell, came into the Charleston office monthly. Cynthia mentioned to Dennis in the course of a routine conversation about contractor invoicing that she had heard something interesting about a development opportunity on Kiowa. She framed it as something she had overheard at a community meeting, repeated it in the tone of someone sharing irrelevant information, and then changed the subject. Dennis Farwell, as Cynthia had reason to believe, had a habit of sharing industry information with Phil Underwood, the general manager of the Vance Grand, with whom he had lunch most months. Phil Underwood, as Warren had observed during his years at the company, had a habit of sharing interesting market information with Robert Vance during their weekly operations meetings in the manner of someone demonstrating that they were paying attention to the broader business environment. 3 weeks after our conversation with Dennis Farwell, Cynthia reported via Signal that Phil had raised the Kiowa opportunity with Robert at the previous Friday's meeting. Robert had asked 2 questions. The first was about the size of the parcel. The second was about the Miami group. That was enough. A man who asks about his competition before he asks about the fundamentals of the investment has already decided he wants it. We sent the prospectus to Robert's office through Coastal Venture Properties' registered address, addressed to Nolan Pierce and Associates, marked as a follow-up to an inquiry that Nolan Pierce had not made. In the cover letter, we noted that a presentation had already been scheduled with the Miami group for the following month, and that we were offering the Vance organization first right of review as a courtesy. Nolan Pierce received the prospectus on a Tuesday. He would read it and flag the land classification question for review. He would open the EPA's public case registry. He would start to type in the case number. And then, for reasons that I would address directly and personally in the following week, he would decide not to complete that search. On a Thursday afternoon in March, my phone showed a Signal notification from CK_internal. 3 words: he wants the prospectus. I walked across the hall and knocked on Warren's door. He read the message over my shoulder. He did not say anything. He simply nodded once slowly with the expression of a man who has waited a very long time for a very specific thing to begin. I arrived at the coffee shop on Folly Beach 20 minutes early and chose a table near the window. Folly Beach is a small barrier island 12 miles south of downtown Charleston, the kind of place that operates at a different pace from the city, unhurried salt, worn full of people who are either very relaxed or very deliberately avoiding somewhere else. Nobody there knew either of us. Nolan Pierce arrived at 9:15, 3 minutes late, which was a small performance of the kind that people in his profession sometimes make to establish that their time is the more valuable of the two. He was 38 years old, clean-shaven, with the kind of physical ease that comes from having been the most capable person in most rooms, for long enough to mistake it for a permanent condition. He ordered an espresso at the counter before sitting down, which told me he intended this to be brief. "Mrs. Vance," he said, "I appreciate you reaching out, though I should note that direct contact between opposing parties during active proceedings is generally—" "I know what it is generally," I said. "Sit down." He sat. I had brought 3 items to the table. The first was a printed summary of what Warren and I had compiled about Grant Dell, his Miami practice, his role in the Bella Crane situation with Gerald Hatch, his subsequent relocation to Charleston, and his position at Nolan's firm. The second was a copy of the methodology note from Ruben Castillo's file describing the shared email draft account and its use during the Miami proceedings. The third was a single printed page showing an email account address registered to a variation of a format that Ruben had identified as Bella's, with a note from Warren's contact indicating that the account was currently active. I laid all 3 on the table in that order and turned them to face him. He looked at them without touching them. He drank his espresso. He set the cup down. "This doesn't establish," he began. "I know what it establishes and what it doesn't," I said. "I am not here to discuss evidence standards. I am here to give you a choice, so listen carefully, because I will only explain it once. He was quiet. The Kiowa Island due diligence report you are currently preparing for your client contains a land classification for the parcel in question. The correct classification under the Coastal Zone Management Act and the county's recorded conservation easements is protected coastal conservation land. That classification means the parcel cannot be developed for commercial use, regardless of the investment amount or the intended purpose. He said nothing. He already knew this. He had been sitting with this knowledge for several days. The preliminary report you file will describe the parcel as commercial pending subject to rezoning review. That classification will support your client's decision to proceed with the investment deposit. Robert Vance will transfer funds from the company's operating reserve into the escrow account established by Coastal Venture Properties. Nolan looked at his empty espresso cup. The alternative, I continued, is that Robert Vance receives by the end of this week a detailed account of your professional history, with Grant Dell your connection to Bella Sinclair's prior situation in Miami, and the existence of the shared account that the two of you have been using to coordinate since she arrived in Charleston. I folded my hands on the table. That information goes to Robert. It also goes to the South Carolina Bar Association and to the federal prosecutor's office with a referral to their wire fraud division, which will find the Miami situation considerably more interesting than I do. The coffee shop made quiet sounds around us, a blender, a door, the particular flat light of an April morning off the water. Nolan Pierce was a man who had built his professional life on the assessment of risk. He was doing that now visibly behind an expression he was working to keep neutral. He was calculating what I had, how much of it was usable, what his exposure was in each scenario, what the least bad outcome looked like from where he was sitting. I let him calculate. The preliminary report, he said finally, that's all. That's all I said. He stood, picked up his jacket from the back of the chair, and left without looking at me again. The preliminary due diligence report was filed with Robert's office 4 days later. The land classification listed was commercial pending subject to coastal rezoning, with a note that EPA review was expected to conclude within 18 months. Robert Vance authorized the transfer of $47 million from Vance Hospitality's operating reserve into the Coastal Venture Properties escrow account the following Monday morning, using his authority as CEO to execute investment deposits below the $50 million threshold that would have required full board approval. I was at Warren's kitchen table when the signal notification arrived from Cynthia at 2:17 in the afternoon. Wire transfer confirmed, $47 million. I showed it to Warren. He read it once. He did not speak for a long moment. Then he got up, went to the kitchen, and came back with 2 cups of coffee that neither of us had asked for. We sat with them and did not say much because there was not much that needed saying. I drove home along Folly Road later that afternoon, the long, flat stretch that runs between the marsh and the back of the island. The light on the water was low and pale. Somewhere beyond the marsh and the barrier and the open Atlantic, a decision had been made, and an amount of money had moved from one account to another, and the distance between Robert Vance and everything he believed he had secured was now measured in months rather than years. I thought for a moment about the night of the awards ceremony, the gardenia scent, the empty chair at table 14, the applause that had rolled through the room while I sat behind the flowers and said nothing. Then I drove home. Between April and June, nothing happened that was visible. That was the design. Warren and I had understood from the beginning that the interval between the wire transfer and the EPA's formal response to any inquiry about the Kiowa parcel would be the most difficult part of the process, not because anything was likely to go wrong, but because waiting in silence while the mechanism completed its work requires a different kind of patience than the kind required to build the mechanism in the first place. Robert Vance waited too. He was waiting for the rezoning review that Nolan Pierce had described as 18 months away. He was waiting comfortably because that is how you wait when you believe the outcome is already decided, and only the calendar stands between you and what you have claimed. He was not waiting for what arrived instead. The letter from the EPA's regional office in Atlanta reached Nolan Pierce's desk on a Monday morning in the second week of June. It was not a rejection technically, it was a clarification. It stated that the parcel referenced in the submitted inquiry, a specific acreage within the Kiowa Island Coastal Conservation Area, had never been subject to a rezoning review, that no case number of the type referenced in the inquiry existed in the agency's active caseload, and that the parcel's conservation status was permanent and not subject to reclassification under current federal coastal protection law. I do not know exactly when Nolan Pierce read the letter or what his face looked like when he did. What I know is that he did not call Robert that Monday. Cynthia reported that Robert spent most of that afternoon attempting to reach Nolan by phone. By evening, Nolan Pierce's office had forwarded all active client files to a colleague, and his personal phone had been disconnected. Robert received the EPA clarification letter himself, forwarded from Pierce and Associates' office on Tuesday morning. What happened the night before that I did not witness. I was in the North Charleston apartment awake, but not expecting anything specific when Cynthia sent a signal message at 6:43 in the morning. She said, "There is something you need to know about last night. Call when you can talk." I called immediately. What Cynthia described, I will recount the way she told it to me, because it is not my account, and I want to be accurate about whose eyes were in that room. Cynthia had worked late that Monday evening, reconciling a set of accounts that she had been monitoring with particular attention for several months. She was in the small glass-walled office off the main lobby of the Vance Grand, shortly before 2 in the morning when she heard the elevator. Bella Sinclair came through the lobby carrying 2 bags, 1 large rolling case, and 1 leather carry-on that Cynthia recognized from the hotel's internal guest registry as having been stored in the private suite. She was wearing a coat despite the warmth of the June evening. She did not stop at the front desk. She did not speak to anyone. She stood for a moment in the center of the lobby floor that I had specified in white Carrara marble 31 years ago. She stood still and she looked around the room, and Cynthia told me that what she saw in Bella Sinclair's expression was not regret or excitement or fear. It was the expression of someone completing an inventory, a final check before departure. Then she walked through the front entrance, got into a taxi that had been waiting at the curb, and was gone. The private safe in the penthouse suite was found open and empty by the housekeeping supervisor the following morning. Robert had given Bella the access code at some point during the months she had lived there. The safe had contained personal cash, not company funds, but Robert's private liquidity reserve, an amount Cynthia estimated based on what she had observed being deposited there over the preceding months at somewhere between $400,000 and $600,000. There was no note. I was still on the phone with Cynthia when my other line showed Robert's number. He called 6 times in the 40 minutes following our conversation. I did not answer. The 7th call came from an unknown number, which I also did not answer. The 8th was from Robert's number again, and by then I had set the phone face down on the table and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window watching the parking lot come into the morning. Cynthia sent one final signal message at 9:14. "He is at the hotel. Phil says he has been there since 7. He is asking about Nolan. He is asking about the escrow. He is asking where she is. No one knows what to tell him because no one knows the answers to any of those questions." Without the $47 million in operating reserve, Vance Hospitality had approximately 6 weeks of cash flow remaining before it would be unable to meet its monthly obligations, supplier payments, staff payroll, debt service on the property loans. The bank held security interests in all 7 properties. Their risk management team would already be running the numbers. By 9 o'clock that morning, Robert Vance had lost his mistress, his lawyer, and $47 million, all before his morning coffee. Douglas Mercer had been the senior lending officer at the bank's Charleston Commercial Division for 11 years. He was, by all accounts, a methodical man, the kind of banker who documents decisions, carefully communicates in writing before acting, and gives clients the full notice period that their loan agreements require before exercising remedies. He had given Vance Hospitality 60 days of written notice after the first covenant breach was reported. He had followed up at 30 days. He had sent a final letter at 14 days. When none of these produced a credible remediation plan, he signed 7 seizure orders on a Tuesday morning in July before the building's air conditioning had finished cycling on for the day. Cynthia photographed each one as it came through on the property fax lines, forwarded the images through Signal, and sent a single accompanying message. "It is done." The seizure orders did not mean the hotels were immediately locked. What they meant was that the bank had formally secured its interest in all 7 properties, and that operational control was now conditional on a resolution of the debt. The hotels remained open, their staff unaware of most of what had happened at the ownership level. But Phil Underwood called Cynthia at 8:47 that morning, speaking rapidly and not quite finishing his sentences, and she told him to keep the properties running and to refer all ownership-related inquiries to the bank's representative. She used a calm voice. She'd been preparing for this moment for 14 months. Robert spent the morning making phone calls that were not returned. His accountant, 3 members of the company's board of directors, 2 attorneys whose names I recognized from the company's historical files as having done work for Vance Hospitality before Nolan Pierce. By noon, Cynthia reported he had driven to the bank's main office on Meeting Street and been met in the lobby by a junior representative who gave him a folder of documents and asked him to please schedule an appointment through the standard process. He arrived at my door at 4:30 in the afternoon. I heard the knock and looked through the peephole before answering. He was standing in the hallway alone without the jacket he had been wearing in every professional context I had seen him in for 30 years. His shirt was open at the collar. His hair, which he had kept precisely managed for as long as I had known him, was not. He was holding a folder, the same one I assumed that the bank's junior representative had handed him in the lobby on Meeting Street. I opened the door. He looked at the apartment behind me the way someone looks at a place they have heard described but expected to be different. I watched him take it in the narrow entry, the low ceiling, the worn carpet, the small table visible through the kitchen doorway. He had made a point at the Sullivan's Island house of commissioning a renovation of the main hall ceiling because the proportions had begun to feel crowded to him. The ceiling in this hallway was a foot lower than that. "Eleanor," he said. His voice had a quality I had not heard in it before, not softness, something more like exposure, the sound of a register that had always been there but had been covered by other things until now. "I know why you're here," I said. "The bank won't take my calls. The properties are frozen. I have 6 weeks of operating runway, maybe less, and I cannot—" He stopped. He pressed his lips together. "I need you to call them. You still have standing as a former partner in the company's founding documentation. If you speak to Mercer, directly ask for a meeting, indicate that the family is engaged with the resolution process, they may extend the window." I had wondered during the months of preparation what I would feel when this conversation happened. I had not known. I had not tried to predict it, because predicting the emotional content of things that have not yet occurred is generally unreliable. What I felt standing in the doorway of a $980 apartment with my former husband in the hallway was something that I did not have a precise word for. It was not satisfaction. It was not pity, though there was something adjacent to pity in it. It was the feeling of a long process completing itself, the specific quiet of an answer arriving after a very long question. "Come in," I said. I stepped back. He came in. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Warren and I had spent months building the thing that had produced the folder in his hands. He described the situation for 20 minutes. I listened. I asked no questions and made no promises. When he finished, I told him I would need time to consider what options were available to me. He left at 5:15. I stood at the kitchen window and watched his car pull out of the parking lot. Then I sat down at the table and waited. Margaret called at 6:41. "The bank's board approved the sale of the debt portfolio to the trust this afternoon," she said. "The transfer of the senior secured creditor position will be recorded with the court by end of business tomorrow. Douglas Mercer has been notified." I looked at the kitchen table, at the place where the folder with Robert's name on it had been sitting 20 minutes ago. "What does he do now?" I said. "He can contest the debt sale in court," Margaret said, "but he has no grounds. The bank followed its process. The sale was at market rate for a distressed portfolio of this type. His option at this point is to negotiate the terms of the resolution with the new creditor. Which is me, I said. Which is you, she said. The hearing is scheduled for the second week of September. That gives you 6 weeks. I looked out the window at the parking lot, which was quiet in the summer evening. A month ago, Robert Vance had believed himself to be the most secure person in any room he walked into. 6 weeks, I said. All right. After we hung up, I sat at the table for a long time without doing anything in particular. Then I went and got the 1991 notebook from the shelf where I kept it, opened it to the notes in the back, and began to prepare for what came next. One number on that page I had not shared with anyone yet. The $47 million that had sat in the Coastal Venture Properties escrow account since April had been absorbed under the terms Margaret had structured directly into the debt purchase, eliminating the need for the full private equity commitment and reducing Warren's exposure to the portfolio. The private equity group remained as a minority partner. The trust held the controlling position. What Robert had pulled from the company's reserve to fund a deal that did not exist had in the end funded the transfer of the company itself to the person he had tried to leave behind. Before I tell you what happened inside that courtroom, comment justice if you believe Eleanor wins. Comment too late if you think Robert finds a way out. I want to see where you stand before the verdict. This story contains fictional elements crafted for understanding and reflection. Names and settings are coincidental, but what this story asks of you is not. I had set my alarm for 5:30 that morning, though I did not need it. I was already awake when it went off, lying on my side in the dark of the North Charleston apartment, looking at the strip of pale light that came under the bedroom door from the hallway. I lay there for a moment longer than necessary. Then I got up, turned off the alarm before the second ring, and began to get dressed in the quiet. From down the hall I heard the iron. Toby had been up before me. He was in his room pressing the collared shirt he had bought with his own money from the bakery on Montague Street, a detail he had mentioned only in passing the week before, as if it were a small thing. I stood outside his door for a moment and listened to the sound of the iron moving across fabric, the faint hiss of steam, the deliberate back and forth of someone who was doing something carefully and did not want to do it twice. Then I went to the kitchen and made coffee for both of us. We drove to downtown Charleston without speaking much. The city was fully awake by the time we crossed into it. Delivery trucks on Meeting Street, joggers on the waterfront path, the particular compressed energy of a weekday morning in a place that takes its business seriously. I found parking 2 blocks from the courthouse and turned off the engine. We sat in the car outside the Charleston County Courthouse for 6 minutes without speaking. The courthouse is on Broad Street, a federal-style building of pale stone that has been administering legal proceedings since before the Civil War. I had driven past it hundreds of times over 33 years. I had attended charity events 1 block east and restaurant dinners 2 blocks west. I had walked my son past it on the way to the waterfront when he was small and still held my hand on busy streets. I had never had reason to go inside. Now I sat and looked at the stone facade and the steps and the flag above the entrance and thought about everything that had been building toward this morning for the better part of a year. And I did not say anything because there was nothing to say that the silence was not already saying. At some point in the 4th minute, Toby reached across the center console and placed his hand on top of mine. He did not look at me. He did not speak. He simply put his hand there and kept it the way he had learned to offer presence without requiring anything in return. I looked at his hand, the same hand that had handed me sandpaper from a garage floor 20 years ago, the same hand that had carried boxes into an apartment on a November morning, the same hand now steady and still in the September light. We sat that way until the 6th minute. Then I opened the door. The inside of the courthouse smelled of wood polish and central air conditioning and the particular institutional quiet of a building that has absorbed a great deal of human anxiety over a very long time and learned to hold it without comment. We found the elevator, went to the 3rd floor, and followed the numbered signs to courtroom 7. The room was smaller than I had imagined. I do not know why I had imagined something larger, perhaps, because the weight of what was going to happen inside it had expanded the space in my mind beyond its actual dimensions. It was wood-paneled, high-ceilinged with windows that faced an interior courtyard and let in a flat, even light that made everything look equally significant. The gallery held perhaps 30 seats. Perhaps a dozen of them were occupied when we arrived by people whose presence was peripheral to the matter at hand: court reporters, a paralegal with a rolling case, 2 observers whose connection to the proceedings I could not determine. Margaret had told me to arrive 15 minutes early and to sit in the gallery without speaking to anyone. We did both. Robert arrived at 9:53. He came through the main doors with an attorney I did not recognize, a man in his 60s, with close-cropped white hair and the slightly compressed expression of someone who had been retained recently and given a situation that was already further along than he would have liked. Robert, by contrast, had composed himself with visible effort. He was dressed carefully, a dark jacket, a shirt I had not seen before, no detail out of place. It was the exterior management of a man who understood that the way you present yourself in a room is a form of argument, and who had been making that argument successfully for 30 years. He sat at the plaintiff's table and opened a folder and reviewed its contents, and did not look toward the gallery. I watched him do this and thought about the morning he had come downstairs in the Sullivan's Island house with the manila envelope and begun the conversation with logistics. The same controlled posture, the same forward orientation. Robert had always believed that the person who looked prepared was already ahead, regardless of what was actually in the folder. What was in his folder this morning would not be enough. The door at the back of the courtroom opened at 9:58. Margaret Steele walked in. She was wearing a dark charcoal suit, not black, which would have been too dramatic, but something close enough to convey the gravity of the matter without performing it. She carried a document case of moderate size and moved through the courtroom at the pace of someone who had decided long before entering exactly what was going to happen and saw no need to hurry toward it. The heels of her shoes made a precise, even sound on the hardwood floor. That sound was, I thought, the most certain thing I had heard in a very long time. She placed her case on the respondent's table, opened it, and arranged 3 folders in front of her with the economy of someone who has done something many times and no longer needs to think about the order. Robert looked at her. I watched his face from the gallery. The controlled expression held for approximately 4 seconds. Then something shifted underneath it, a very slight tightening around the jaw, a recalculation happening too quickly to fully conceal. He leaned toward his attorney and said something in a low voice. His attorney put a hand flat on the table and responded without looking up from his own papers. Judge Patricia Holst entered at 10 o'clock precisely, and the room rose. She was in her late 50s with close-cropped silver hair and reading glasses on a lanyard. She moved to the bench with the unhurried authority of someone who had presided over enough hearings to have developed a comprehensive understanding of human behavior under legal pressure and had organized her patients accordingly. This is a creditor status hearing in the matter of the Vance Hospitality debt portfolio, she said, settling into her chair and opening the case file before her. We are here to establish the identity and standing of the senior secured creditor following the sale of the debt portfolio by First Carolina Commercial Bank. Ms. Steele, you may proceed. Margaret stood. Your Honor, the senior secured creditor of the Vance Hospitality debt portfolio, as of the date of transfer recorded with this court, is Eleanor Margaret Vance, acting through the Aldrich Family Trust in partnership with a private equity entity whose full documentation has been filed with the court. The total debt position acquired represents 100% of Vance Hospitality's outstanding secured obligations across all 7 properties. The room absorbed this. Not dramatically, there was no gasp, no visible reaction from the gallery. It was a quieter shift than that. The kind of quiet that settles over a room when something has been said that will require time to fully process, and everyone present understands this simultaneously. Robert's attorney was on his feet. Your Honor, we would contest the characterization of this transaction as a legitimate arm's-length debt sale, given that the acquiring party is the former spouse of the debtor and may have had access to non-public financial information that influenced. The transaction was conducted at documented market rates for a distressed portfolio of this type, Margaret said, without raising her voice or adjusting her posture. The bank's board authorized the sale following its established review process. We have an independent valuation report from a nationally certified firm and the full board authorization. I am happy to submit both to the court for review. She placed a folder on the clerk's desk without waiting for a response. Judge Holst looked at Robert's attorney. He sat down. Additionally, Margaret continued, I am filing today a report from a forensic document examiner concerning the prenuptial agreement submitted in the original divorce proceedings. The examiner, Dr. Francis Whitmore, of the University of South Carolina's Forensic Document Program, conducted analysis of the ink composition paper, dating, and signature formation on the document in question. Her finding is that the signature appearing on the second party's signature line was produced by digital reproduction, specifically a high-resolution scan of an authentic signature applied to the document through printing rather than by original wet ink application at the time of signing. The two processes leave distinct and measurable differences in ink depth edge definition and paper fiber compression. Dr. Whitmore's methodology and findings are detailed in the report. She set a second folder on the clerk's desk. The notary who certified that document, Victor Hollings, has voluntarily surrendered his notary commission to the state following an unrelated complaint filed 3 months ago. We are filing a separate criminal referral in this matter with the United States Attorney's Office, given that the document was submitted in federal divorce proceedings. Robert's attorney was writing on his legal pad with the focused urgency of someone trying to stay ahead of a current moving faster than anticipated. Robert was not writing anything. He was not looking at his attorney. He was looking at Margaret with the expression of a man who has realized several minutes too late that the person across the room had arrived with considerably more than he had prepared for. Then he looked at me. It was the first time our eyes had met since the morning 10 months ago when he had sat across the kitchen table with a folder in his hands and told me the terms of what he had decided my life would become. I had looked at him then and said nothing. I looked at him now and did the same. There was nothing to add. The room was already saying everything that needed to be said. He held my gaze for a moment. Then something moved across his face that I did not have a precise name for, not regret, exactly, but something in its vicinity. The particular expression of a person who has understood all at once the full distance between where they believed they were standing and where they actually are. Mrs. Vance. His voice was controlled. The control was audible the way effort is always audible when it is being applied to something that would otherwise move very differently. Where did you get the money? The room was still. Judge Holst looked at him, then at me, and gave a brief, deliberate nod. I answered, "From the $180,000 you gave me," I said. "From the earnings of a 15-year-old boy who pressed his own shirt this morning and took a bus to a courtroom to sit 2 rows behind his mother, and from a man whose career you ended and whose life you took apart with fabricated evidence and a buried memo, who kept every document for 8 years in an apartment across the hall from mine and waited for someone to call." The room held that. Robert sat with it for a long moment. He looked down at the folder in front of him. He looked at his attorney. Then he turned in his chair and looked toward the gallery, past the first row, past my row, to the 3rd row behind me. Toby was sitting still and straight in his pressed collar, his hands folded on his knees, his eyes forward. He had been sitting in exactly that position since we arrived. He had not shifted. He had not looked away. Robert's mouth opened. "Son," he said. Toby stood up. Toby walked to the front of the courtroom without hurrying. He did not look at me as he passed the row where I was sitting. He looked straight ahead at his father, the way you look at something you have made a decision about and do not intend to revisit. He stopped at the low wooden railing that separated the gallery from the floor of the court, and he stood there, and for a moment, the room was completely still. Judge Holst looked at him. "Young man." "Your Honor," Toby said. His voice was steady. "My name is Toby Vance. I am Robert Vance's son. I would like to say something if the court will allow it." The judge looked at both attorneys. Robert's attorney offered no objection. Margaret gave a small, precise nod. "You may speak," the judge said. Toby put both hands on the railing. He looked at his father. Robert was watching him with an expression that I recognized as hope, the specific, diminished hope of a man who has run out of other options. "I heard what you said in the other courtroom," Toby said. "The one where you gave up custody. I was there. Mom didn't know." He paused. "You said I was a scheduling conflict. I think you meant it as a practical thing, not a cruel thing. But I've had 9 months to think about it, and I'm not sure the difference matters." Robert's expression changed. "I'm not here to say anything against you," Toby continued. "I'm here because you called my name and I thought you deserved an answer. The answer is that I hope things go as well as they can for you. I mean that. But I'm not going to be available to help with whatever comes next. That's all." He stepped back from the railing. He turned and walked back to his seat past my row and sat down 2 rows behind me. The room was quiet for a moment longer than it needed to be. Then Judge Holst returned to the matter before her. The civil hearing concluded within the hour. Eleanor Margaret Vance, acting through the Aldrich Family Trust in partnership with a private equity entity, was confirmed as the senior secured creditor of Vance Hospitality Group. The debt-to-equity conversion process, which would transfer operational and ownership control of the 7 hotels to the trust upon completion of the required filings, was authorized to proceed. Robert left the building without looking at either of us. 9 days later, a federal grand jury returned an indictment on 4 counts, 2 counts of tax evasion, 1 count of conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and 1 count related to the fabricated prenuptial agreement charged as forgery and fraud upon the court. The indictment was the result of the criminal referral Margaret had filed, combined with the files Warren had preserved for 8 years, which the U.S. Attorney's Office described in a statement I read, but did not save, as among the most thoroughly documented cases of sustained financial fraud they had reviewed in recent years. Robert was processed and released on bail. He did not call Toby. His attorney sent a letter to Margaret's office requesting that Toby Vance be asked to provide a character reference in support of the bail conditions. Margaret forwarded the letter to me and asked how I would like her to respond. I brought the letter home. I left it on the kitchen table. That evening, Toby came home from school, saw it, picked it up, and read it. He set it back down on the table without comment. Then he went to his room and came back 20 minutes later with a single sheet of paper written by hand, which he placed beside the original letter. I read it. It was 4 sentences. It stated that Toby Robert Vance, acting of his own will and without coercion, was declining to serve as a character reference in the matter referenced. It offered no explanation and no apology. At the bottom, in his particular handwriting, the handwriting I had watched form itself, letter by letter over 15 years, was his signature. He handed it to me and said, "She taught me that every signature matters. She taught me how to write my name. She also taught me that it is all right to write no." I folded the letter and gave it back to him to send. The next morning, I called Margaret and told her to respond to Robert's attorney accordingly. Then I went back to work. In the weeks after the hearing, I did not allow myself the luxury of stopping to assess what had happened. There was too much to do. The company needed operating leadership while the ownership transfer was completed. I worked with Cynthia, who I promoted to Chief Financial Officer in the first week of October, a title she had earned 14 months earlier and had simply been waiting for someone with authority to assign to stabilize the hotels, reassure the staff, and establish a credible path forward for the properties. Phil Underwood remained as general manager of the flagship property. He was good at his work and had not personally been party to what Robert had done. He adapted to the new reporting structure with the pragmatism of someone who had spent 30 years in hospitality management and understood that buildings outlast the people who own them. Warren came to the office twice during October. He sat in the chair across from Cynthia's desk and reviewed figures the way he had once reviewed them in this same company, in a different context with a different name above the door. He did not say much. He did not need to. In the third week of October, the creative team I had hired on a consulting basis presented 3 options for the company's new visual identity. I had asked them at the outset to build around one specific element, the handwriting from the first page of the 1991 notebook. The inside cover. Not the sketches, not the specifications, but the name. Eleanor M. Aldrich, written in ink that had been drying for 34 years. The first option used it as a secondary element. The second incorporated it into the logo mark, but reduced it. The third placed it as the primary signature beneath the company name, exactly as it appeared in the notebook in the proportions and weight it had always had. I chose the third. The new identity launched the following week on the company's digital platforms and across all 7 properties. The name above the door remained Vance Hospitality. It was the name the company had built its reputation under, and reputations are worth keeping when the reputation itself is sound, even if the person who claimed it was not. But beneath the name on every property sign, every piece of stationery, every door card and website footer was a handwritten signature in dark ink, clean and unhurried. It was mine. It had always been mine. It had simply taken 34 years for it to appear in the right place. On a Tuesday in early November, Warren Pruitt received a small envelope at his apartment in North Charleston. It had been sent by hand, no return address on the outside, no postage stamp, which meant someone had put it directly in the building's mail slot. Inside were 2 items, a brass key on a plain ring, and a small piece of paper with 4 words written on it. It was always yours. Below the words was a signature he recognized. He recognized it because he had spent the better part of 2 months looking at it in various contexts over the preceding year, on trust documents, on legal filings, on the inside cover of a brown leather notebook that had started everything. It was the same handwriting, the same unhurried construction of letters, the same quality of someone who had learned early that the way you write your name is a form of position-taking. The key was to an apartment on the 2nd floor of a building 6 blocks from where Warren currently lived. It was the apartment he had owned outright before the legal proceedings 8 years ago, the one he had managed to keep because it had been purchased in cash and registered in a trust before any of the other assets had been touched. He had been unable to return to it after his release because the building had changed management and the new owners had converted the unit to a rental. He had signed a lease for the North Charleston apartment instead and had not thought about the other place again in a way that was productive. He had not known that I had been in contact with the building's ownership group had established that the current tenant's lease had reached its natural end and had arranged quietly, and without mentioning it to him, for the unit to be returned to its registered owner at the first available opportunity. Warren sat in the chair by his window for a long time with the key in his hand. The gray cat climbed onto his lap and settled there, with the indifference of an animal that has seen its owner in worse circumstances and is not impressed by the improvement. Warren put one hand on the cat and looked at the key with the other. After a while, he got up, put on his coat, and went to look at the apartment. In my own office, a room on the 4th floor of the Vance Grand, a room I had not occupied before because it had always been Robert's, the 1991 notebook, sat open on the desk in the particular early evening light that came through the east-facing windows I had specified for that precise effect 34 years ago on a concrete floor eating a sandwich because we could not afford a lunch break. The page it was open to was not the inside cover. It was not one of the sketches. It was one of the blank pages near the back, the ones I had written on in December of the previous year at a kitchen table in North Charleston, alone in the dark with the $180,000 I had been given as the price of everything I had built. On that page in my own hand were 4 words: trust, distress debt, control, and below them underlined once what she built. I closed the notebook and left it on the desk. There was still a great deal of work to do. There always is when you are building something worth keeping. I put on my coat, the navy wool one, the one with the deep pockets, the one that still had a small folded piece of paper in the right side, and I went back to work. I would not change the strategy, but I would change the silence. Do not disappear inside your own patience. Do not build an empire for someone who has never learned to say your name. That is the one thing I wish someone had told me 30 years ago. Greed is loud, loyalty is quiet, and sometimes what looks like losing is only God giving you the distance you need to see clearly. Stories like mine are called revenge cheating stories, and I understand why. But the real lesson in every true family story I have ever known is not about punishment. It is about the moment you decide you are worth fighting for. The best revenge cheating stories are not about revenge at all. These true family stories belong to all of us. If you have ever been invisible inside your own life, you already know the ending. And if you want more revenge cheating stories and true family stories told without flinching, subscribe, leave a comment, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for staying until the very end. The stories ahead contain some fictional elements crafted for reflection. If that is not for you, choose what serves you best. But if you are staying, I am glad you are here.